everybody. This is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with author and fellow bassist Rob Van Den Broek. And Rob is coming to us from the Netherlands, and again, another one of these great opportunities to chat via Skype, making the planet a lot smaller and working in a fashion that we can bring Rob into your cell phone or your living room, wherever you are. In case you don't know who Rob is the author of, and I'm going to hold it up here into my camera, the Gibson Bass Book. So that said, we're going to definitely talk about the book a little more in depth, but let's get started with your bass journey, Rob. How did you get started and involved in bass?
Oh, well, I've always loved music, loved to listen to music. Even when I was a little toddler, I used to crawl on the floor again, with my ear against the speakers when my mother was vacuum cleaning the house, etc. I always wanted to hear music. And when I was 12, I asked my parents if I could get guitar lessons. I wanted to learn to play that instrument. I wanted to play bass, but it wasn't possible to learn bass playing back in that time. So I had to settle for a Spanish guitar. Okay. So I got classical training, with the adagios and the andantes and the little Bach pieces. And so I was schooled in a classical way. I had a guitar teacher who was a very big fan of flamenco. And after 2 or 3 years on the nylon strings, I wanted to play bass. So I joined a band with a few friends in high school, and I borrowed my first bass. Every Wednesday when we had a rehearsal, I went to this guy and picked up his cheap Fender jazz bass copy, and I got to play for like 2 hours on that afternoon, and then I brought the bass back, and at home I had to study all the parts on my classical guitar until I had earned enough money with picking cherries or picking strawberries or whatever little jobs there were to buy my own bass guitar. And my own bass guitar was an Ibanez Blazer bass, which is sort of a Fender Precision copy. Mm-hmm. And I loved that thing to death, but I also modified it to death, literally, because I sawed things off, and I changed the headstock from the 4-in-line configuration to a 3-and-1, just like the Music Man Stingray. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, it was beyond repair. So I had to buy a new one. Gotcha. And that was an Ibanez too. There was a sound gear, but it was so sterile. There was no real character in it. So I really didn't like it. Mm-hmm. So I bought another bass, which was a Stingray, Music Man Stingray, and I played on that for like 10 years, I think, with intensively with the bands that I played in, and recorded with it with my band. And but at a certain point, I went to a concert in 1994, and that was a gig of the American band Cry of Love with their bass player Robert P. Kearns, and he was using this amazing bass. I had never seen one like that before, which was a Gibson Triumph, which is a Gibson Les Paul bass, and he had the best sound I had ever heard, and he was using two 8x10 Ampeg refrigerators, mm-hmm. with the SVT, and it sounded amazing. So right there on that spot, I decided I need to have such a bass guitar. I need to have a Gibson Les Paul bass.
Gotcha.
But this was pre-internet. This was, internet was there, but it was very small. Mm-hmm. And I decided I wanted one, but I couldn't find it because they are very rare.
Sure.
And it took me years to finally find one in Amsterdam in a small store they had a Gibson Les Paul bass, and it was not exactly the same bass as Robert P. Kearns had used with Cry of Love, but it was actually the predecessor of that bass, the Les Paul bass, without a built-in impedance transformer. And that bass that this little shop in Amsterdam had was literally in a closet between the brooms and the buckets. They had totally forgotten about it, and there were only 3 strings on it. One pickup was there. There was a switch missing, but I could see the character of the bass was there, and I just rescued it from the broom closet. Took it home, gave it a lot of TLC, and well, it rose from the ashes like a phoenix, and it has become my favorite bass since that day, and I still use it a lot. So that's how I got bitten by the Gibson bug, I guess.
Gotcha.
With that first Les Paul bass.
Well, and it's interesting because we are fortunate in this particular time in history to be living in a time when electric bass, which is relatively a new instrument. I mean, if you compare to the classical guitar that you started on, where the Spaniards were playing it, the Moorish were playing. I mean, this goes back, and I'm sure if we trace it back, we'd probably be going to lute and other string instruments of the sort. But the electric bass is a relatively new instrument, and as such, we are privileged to be involved while the instrument itself is evolving. And that is something that I noticed as I was looking at your book, that you see kind of the evolution of the instrument as it's going, which again you've mentioned, it's rare, and you're absolutely right. If I were to go to a music store nearby right now, the chances of finding a Gibson bass are probably relatively rare. So every bassist seems to be on a search for their ideal instrument, and when you can find either the type or the kind, you go, okay, now we're talking. So from getting your first Gibson, this passion ignited in you that motivated you to write a whole book about Gibsons. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, when I had first bought my first Gibson Les Paul bass, I didn't know anything about these basses, so I went to search on the internet for some information, and I stumbled upon a website which was a sort of onboard community. It was called the Dude Pit. It was a forum for bass players, and which was run by Steve Dude Barr, and there was a very enthusiastic Gibson community there. And there were people discussing Thunderbirds and Victory basses and EB3s and EBOs and a lot of other Gibson bass guitars I had never heard of. And there was a sort of a connection with that Gibson community. Nice folks, nice people, and it was a growing community. And the good thing was, or the nice thing, was that these were all people who were really Gibson fanatics, and who refused to live up to the Fender kingdom. Fender has obviously set the standard for rock and pop music with the bass guitar, with the Fender Precision and the Fender Jazz Bass. But Gibson lovers are not looking for that kind of sound. So there were a lot of people who were talking about Thunderbirds and all the other models that we just mentioned. And at a certain point, someone got the idea, why don't we make a CD with songs with us playing in our band on our various Gibson basses. So we made a sort of a CD with all the people from that Gibson community, and there was a guy from Canada using an RD standard bass, and there was a guy from England using an EB3, and so there were people from all over the planet who were frequenting the Dude Pit a lot, sending in their music. They recorded with their band on their Gibson bass, so we had a Dude Pit Gibson bass CD, and everybody was very happy with that CD, and we thought, well, if we can do this, why don't we make a coffee table book about Gibson basses? We got a lot of different Gibson bass owners here in our community, and if everyone sends in a picture of their bass, we can throw it together and make a beautiful book. Mm-hmm. And me being a graphic designer by profession, I said, well, send those pictures over and I'll make a nice design and the book will be ready soon enough. But that never happened because people were busy with their lives, and making good pictures is not very easy. Gotcha. And after a while, the Dude Pit website stopped. It went down, so we sort of lost contact with each other. And after a few years, I joined a new discussion board with a lot of people that I still knew from the Dude Pit days, mm-hmm. and we sort of revived that idea. Let's make that book, yeah. But somehow it just didn't happen. People said, "Well, I'm going to help you. I'm going to send you over some stuff, and I'm going to write a little about each bass," but it never happened. And then one day, when the economic crisis had hit, I had just too much spare time in my graphic design studio. So I thought, well, what am I going to do all day here? So I thought, well, let's start this book, and I'm going to do it myself. And I started collecting pictures from the internet from all across the world, and sort of make an Excel sheet with all the different bases that you have. Mm-hmm. And I calculated how many pages is the book going to be, and I tried to find some text about these Gibson basses. So I had a sort of a rough setup made for this book, but then, yeah, you can't print a book with pictures from the internet. The resolution is too high. You get 3 dpi, and you need 300 dpi sure. for print. So that was no good. So I had to have good pictures. And well, I was in the lucky circumstance that I had a good friend called Uwe Hornum, who is a Gibson collector who lives in Frankfurt, in Germany. And he owns just about every model that Gibson has ever built. Mm-hmm. He has one. Oh, wow. So I decided to go to Frankfurt one weekend, take my mobile photo studio with me, a few lamps, a few lights, a few backdrops. Sure. And me and my then colleague went to Frankfurt, and we photographed all of Uwe's bass guitars. We photographed the complete front, complete backside. We photographed details, the body, the headstock, whatever we thought was necessary. And we shot, I think, more than 1,000 pictures in that weekend. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing was, every time I went into Uwe's office to pick up one of his bass guitars, because he has them in his office. It's incredible. His entire office is like a Gibson bass museum. Wow. So I stepped into his office to pick up one bass guitar and to bring it to the next room where we had set up this photo studio. Uwe always had a little anecdote with any bass I'd pick up. He said, "Oh, that's a nice one. That's the Lee Sklar signature," which he hardly ever used. There are only 2 pictures of Lee Sklar with that bass guitar, mm-hmm. and I think the little fling Lee had with Gibson was over before the bass was even released. So, wow. But Uwe had these anecdotes with every bass that I picked up. So I thought, well, I can use those little stories he has to make the book, more vibrant. Mm-hmm. And then when I got back home and I was selecting the photographs and thinking what I'm going what am I going to tell about all these bass guitars? I thought, well, let's ask Uwe if he can maybe write a few anecdotes and contribute to the words of the book. Sure. So Uwe did, and about once a month, a little story of Uwe came in the mail, and I could paste that into the page of that certain bass guitar.
Sure.
And sometimes he didn't send anything for like 2 months, and I said, "Hey, Uwe, it's about time you sent another one." And then he sent 2 or 3 or 4 stories, and slowly but surely, this book started to take form, and it started to become a reality. Mm-hmm. Of course, I had to write a lot of text myself too. And I visited this very cool website called Fly Guitars from Jules Hafeke a lot, mm-hmm. which also has a lot of information about Gibson bass guitars. And I spent hours on the internet searching for information. And at a certain point, my studio had already become much busier, so I had to put the book aside for a few weeks or months even. Mm-hmm. And but last summer I had just quit my band, and I was without a band for the first time in 34 years.
Wow!
So I had a lot of spare time. So I thought, well, this is the time I ought to finish that book, because I'd been working on this book on and off for like maybe 7 years, and I thought, well, it's about time this book got printed. Mm-hmm. So I spent a lot of time from like August until October to finish that book, and then I sent it to the printer, and well, now the book is here. So
yes, the book is here. Yes,
yeah.
This is great. This is great. Well, and kind of interesting, the evolution of the Gibson, because on one hand, if you think of the stream with Fender, and I will include Fender clones, because it's a whole, it looks like this one thing, you know, and it has been their solid approach to it. This is the way, and it's recognizable worldwide. I mean, people see it and they go, "Oh, this is this."
Yeah.
I myself have a knockoff. It's a Fernandez, but it looks it's a 1970 Fernandez, but it looks just like a Fender, and so it was kind of the choice where a lot of manufacturers and luthiers and builders were going, okay, we're going to go like Fender, and in some instances take the Fender essence and do what we can to make it how we think better. Whether it is lighter or it has different electronics, but headstock, neck shape, you name it, very, very Fenderish. Now Gibson, kind of rebellious, said, we're going to do everything possible to not look like Fender.
Yeah.
And so talk to us a little bit about kind of the sequence of evolution of these Gibson guitars. You know, like what was the first Gibson bass that showed up?
Yeah, well, the first real electric bass that showed up was the EB, which was the violin-shaped bass, which was a short-scale bass with a solid body and a set neck, so a glued-in neck, and that was actually in the era that the Fender bass, the Fender Precision bass, had just been invented. So it wasn't like the dust had settled down and the whole world knew, well, this is how you build a bass guitar. Mm-hmm. So Gibson just started at a certain point, let's do it this way. And it even was the intention to sort of replace the double bass. So this first electric bass, the EB, came with a telescopic pin on the lower bout where you hang the strap, and you could play it upright. This bass. So that Gibson was still not really sure are bass players going to play it like a guitar, or are going to play it like a stand-up double bass?
Gotcha.
So that was maybe the reason why they make the violin shaped, to sort of hint to the double bass.
Exactly.
After a few years, Gibson introduced a new bass guitar, which was the second version, which was the EBO. And that was a slightly different body shape, more like a Les Paul Junior double cut. Okay. Still had a huge pickup straight at the neck with a very woolly, woofy sound. And after that came the semi-hollow bass guitar, the EB2, which had a sort of the same body shape as an ES335. That was also a short scale, and this was in the era that the rock and roll had just been invented, and the British beat boom became popular. And strangely enough, back in that day, all these British beat boom bands used the Epiphone Rivoli or the EB2. So in that day, for that kind of music, the Fender Precision and the Fender Jazz Bass weren't really the obvious choice yet. But when the music got louder, like the EB2 was more feedback prone, and the Fender Precision or the Jazz Bass didn't have these issues. So they sort of gained ground and became more popular. Gotcha. So when rock music really started to become loud, the Gibsons went to the side and the Fenders came to the forefront.
Gotcha. So what followed in the evolution? Because again, you mentioned the Les Paul kind of design, and it was kind of more of a guitar hollow body looking kind of thing. What happened next? What was the next evolution that they said, okay, because they needed more volume, they needed to be louder, I guess. Was that?
Yeah. Well, Gibson found out that the short scale wasn't the best choice, maybe for bass guitar. You can discuss about that, because I really love short scale, but they introduced the Thunderbird.
Okay.
The Thunderbird was the first long scale bass Gibson made, and they used two humbuckers on that bass, on the Thunderbird 4, and they used one humbucker on the Thunderbird 2. So that's there were two versions, and strangely enough, Fender made a remark or complaint about the shape, that it was resembling one of their designs too much. So Gibson said, well, okay, we're going to flip it over. So that became the Thunderbird non-reverse, as we call it, which looks even more like a Fender.
Yeah.
But that was the first long scale bass they made, and they made plenty of long scale basses after that. But Gibson is a kind of a weird brand as it comes to bass guitars. They always find a way to ruin the things. So their marketing decisions are sometimes kind of erratic. You can't follow what they're thinking. Hence the many models that Gibson has introduced over the years and has rejected over the years. So that's why you can make a book with more than 80 different Gibson bass models, because they keep on trying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and as I've had the opportunity to go to the Gibson booth at the Winter NAMM shows, I was really surprised, because you only see, certain models now, like the Thunderbirds. You come to expect those, and I think the iconic kind of double horn kind of shape
Yeah.
that you see. But when I was looking in your book, there were models that it seemed like a good idea, and then no
Yeah.
longer.
Exactly.
Kind of like
Yeah.
a flying. There was a flying V
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
shape, and just
And
variety.
the flying V, it took them forever to introduce that. Even they were how do you say that in English? Ibanez got to it first. They introduced the flying V bass before Gibson even did that, and then they thought, well, maybe it's a good idea. The flying V guitar is a successful guitar,
Sure.
which wasn't initially, but when the 70s and the hard rock bands came, it became successful. And then they thought, well, let's make a flying V bass.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they chose the wrong pickups for that bass. They chose the Ripper bass pickups, and they don't sound good in that shape in the flying V bass. But that was rejected soon enough.
Mm-hmm.
And well, there were many modules that they introduced, and they rejected a few years after.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because for anybody, and we last year we just celebrated the year of the luthier, and it was very fascinating to see how there are some key factors that contribute to the sound of an instrument. And you are apparently a very daring bassist in that you would be willing to modify and change and get into kind of the works of it if you're going to change like the shape of your headstock and things. But choices of wood, like when we see with a lot of the Thunderbirds, they'll use like a mahogany or something.
Yeah.
Having the choices of the shape,
Yeah.
and those widely varying from what we're used to seeing, the things that have cavities inside to have some airspace and some movement there. And then electronics, what kind of pickups they're using, and whether they're humbucking or they're split coil or single coil, and the combinations of this.
Yeah, this Les Paul bass that I have, my first Gibson bass, has really the best pickup design I've ever heard, and that was really Les Paul's work, because Les Paul was a real electronics geek, and he was an inventor. He made a lot of prototypes, sacrificing perfectly beautiful basses, and he just hacksawed holes in it, and he put very crude control plates on it with his own homemade pickups, which looked like just a huge blob of black epoxy.
Oh, wow.
But they sounded great, and what Les Paul did with these low impedance pickups, he made 3 coil tabs on those humbuckers, which are stacked humbuckers, so the coils are on top of each other, and out of every low impedance humbucker come no less than 8 leads to connect to all kinds of switches to make a choice between the first a couple of windings and the second and the third. So that's the tone selector on that Les Paul bass, which gives a large variety of sounds. And that was Les Paul was instrumental on that search for the best sound. So I really admire him for that journey that he was willing to dive into.
Absolutely. And then, as if that wasn't enough, to further complicate things, as electronics have changed and gotten better, and you start adding in pedals and things that a lot of people are going, well, the basics that we had before don't matter anymore, because I am going to mimic a kind of a sound, or the amplifier, as you were talking, like you had an Ampeg sound. A lot of amps don't use tubes anymore, but they try to give you a tube-like sound. So it's a fascinating evolution. One of the great things about your book is that it's very open-ended because Gibson continues to build instruments, and I think it'll be very interesting from this foundation to see how things continue to evolve, because there is a competitive market side, but sometimes you're absolutely right. You go, what are they thinking when they're doing this? That you know, everybody else seems to be going this way and they're going this way, or you know, making those different choices. And I think the key thing I want our readers to take away is that there is, and it was kind of the eye-opener for me as I was going through your book, is that it's like almost an alternative universe happening simultaneously. As historically Fender's going this way, all of this is going on with the Gibson line. And so I have to stress that if you want to really get into this, you need to get this book and kind of go through here and go, oh my gosh, I never knew, or I never imagined that this was what was going on here. So do you have, it might be hard to speculate, but what do you think is in the future? Based on what you've seen, the trajectory, what do you think will happen with Gibson basses in the future?
Well, when I visited Gibson in November, I did the launch party for the book there in Amsterdam, in the Gibson headquarters from Amsterdam, in a beautiful showroom. And they told me in 2018 they will introduce 3 new bass guitar models.
Wow.
I have no idea what they will be, but I guess Gibson will also reissue a few of their bass guitars, because they've made a lot of different models, and they have already done quite a few reissues, but there's still plenty to be done.
Sure.
And somehow Gibson always manages to just not get it right. You know, they do a reissue and they change little things, and they change so much little things that the true fans say, well, this is not what I had hoped for. I had hoped for a true grabber reissue, and what do they do? They put a new pickup in it, or they change the shape of the headstock or whatever. But Gibson will probably do a few more reissues, and hopefully a few real true new models. But you never know with them. It's sort of erratic in their marketing and strategy decisions. I don't know. They just reintroduced this EB that they did in 2013, and they gave it a sort of a new look with a longer upper horn and a different headstock shape. This bass resembles more a toe bias bass.
Okay.
And or PV. Some people see a PV shape in it, or the reissue of the Epiphone Embassy, more like that shape. But the electronics, the pickups are the same as the 2013 version. But yeah, somehow they think it's necessary to redesign.
Gotcha.
That's another base for in the book, for in the second edition, I guess.
Exactly. Well, and it is interesting because it is a whole other approach. Because again, as we've said, with Fender, there's been certainly an evolution, but they've stayed very steady with one kind of.
There was no need to change it, you know. Like Leo Fender got it right the first time, so never change a winning team. But Gibson somehow never managed to break open the bass guitar market, and except for maybe the Thunderbirds, which is sort of their flagship bass and is kind of popular, and gotta say the EB3 or the new one, the SG reissue as they name it, is a good bass too, which has a solid following among bass players, but not in the amounts that the precision or the jazz bass has ever sold, of course.
Gotcha. Well, Rob, again, I appreciate you sharing some insight into this fascinating book. For those of us that play bass, I know we all know about Gibson basses. I mean, you kind of glance, you go, okay, yeah, I know. But
they all sound muddy, and they're all short scale. That's not true, but
who knew? Who knew there was so much going on with Gibson? And I was very surprised to see a whole book about it. I'm going, oh my gosh, because I spoke with some authors on another bass book, and there's mention of Gibson, but it's small, it's just a little bit here. So what's the best way for people? Because again, I think they're going to be interested. They're going to want to see your book. Where's the best place? I know, I think I'd seen there's a website. I've got the GibsonBassBook.com.
Yes, true. That's my site, and people can go over there and order the book. It's real simple. It's a very tiny little web shop with only one product. This book.
This book. Okay. So that's the best place for people to find information and all that. Yeah. And we're going to, of course, they'll see this video, which again I think will get a lot of people interested in going, hey, let me find out more about this, and maybe the next time I'm in my music store, see if I can find out what they're talking about, because again, it's so unique. Well, thanks again, folks. You've seen it here. Rob Van Den Broek, the Gibson Bass Book. Check it out. Learn more about Gibson. Learn more about your instrument. Even if you don't start playing a Gibson, because obviously it's a very passionate area for the Gibson fans, it's something very interesting to know more about. So that said, you've seen this coming to you live from Bass Musician Magazine. Thank you a lot, Rob.
Thank you very much, Raul.